The inheritance that would shatter Ilara Vance's world did not arrive in a lawyer's crisp envelope or a solemn phone call. It began with the whisper of ruin and the taste of desperation on a Tuesday morning so bleak the gray sky seemed to press down on the very roofs of the city. She became the owner of 4 acres of industrial wasteland, a field of shattered brick and twisted rebar where the old Vance candle factory had once stood, for the grand total of $1. A single worn bill she handed over to a bored city clerk who didn't even look up. Unbeknownst to her, that dollar was the key to a $407 million fortune. A legacy of secrets buried under the rubble of her own family's forgotten history, and a battle against forces so powerful they had already erased her past and were poised to steal her future. Before we dive into the heart of this unbelievable story, if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more tales that will leave you breathless. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now back to Ilara, standing on the edge of her new, broken kingdom. The deed felt impossibly flimsy in her hand, a single sheet of paper against the vastness of the decay before her. To any sane person, it was a liability, a graveyard of industry. To Ilara, a single mother whose world had shrunk to the size of overdue bills and the quiet worry in her 8-year-old son's eyes, it was something else entirely. It was a foothold. It was ground. It was hers. The air smelled of damp concrete and ancient soot, a ghost scent of the wax and chemicals that had once been rendered here. Weeds, tenacious and green, pushed their way through cracks in the foundation. Nature's slow, indifferent reclamation project. Leo, her son, stood beside her, his small hand tucked into hers, his gaze wide with a child's uncomplicated awe. He didn't see the hazardous waste signs or the chain-link fence sagging like a weary sigh. He saw a castle of rubble, a dragon's hoard of interesting rocks and mysterious, dark holes. "Is it all ours, Mama?" he asked, his voice a small, clean sound in the oppressive silence. "Every last broken piece," she said, forcing a smile that felt as brittle as the shattered window panes in the one wall still partially standing. She had bought it on a whim fueled by exhaustion. The city's dollar lot program was a last-ditch effort to offload derelict properties, a way to pass the burden of demolition onto the hopeful or the foolish. Ilara wasn't sure which she was. All she knew was that for the price of a lottery ticket, she could own something tangible, a piece of the city that had for so long felt like it was actively trying to chew her up and spit her out. She worked 2 jobs. One cleaning office buildings downtown where the windows gleamed and the air was chilled to an expensive perfection. The other serving lukewarm coffee in a diner where the linoleum was peeling. Her life was a frantic, tightrope walk over a chasm of financial ruin. Owning this mess, it was an act of defiance. A declaration that she was still here, still standing, even if her property wasn't. They spent the first hour just walking the perimeter, their sneakers crunching on a carpet of gravel and disintegrated brick. Ilara pointed out the faint outline of what must have been the main building, the loading docks now just a crumbling ledge. Leo found a half-melted gear, thick with rust but still beautiful in its mechanical symmetry, and declared it the heart of a fallen robot. The acquisition was absurd. She had no money to clear the land, no plan to build on it. Her most ambitious dream for the plot was a small, fenced-in community garden, a patch of green where she and Leo could grow tomatoes and forget, for a few hours a week, the suffocating confines of their tiny apartment. But as the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the debris, a different feeling began to settle in her chest. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something heavier, a sense of presence. The ruin wasn't just an empty space. It was a place of endings, of a business that had failed, of lives that had been uprooted. She felt the weight of its history, a story she didn't know but could feel in the cold radiating from the ground. She saw a flicker of movement near the base of the remaining wall and her body tensed, her arm instinctively pulling Leo closer. But it was just a piece of loose sheet metal, swinging in the breeze, catching the dying light. Chimed a low, mournful note, a bell tolling for a forgotten world. That night, sleep did not come easily. The image of the factory was burned into her mind. She thought of the $1 bill, the almost laughable transaction that had made her a landowner. It felt like a folk tale, a parable waiting for its moral. She had bought a piece of the past, a square on a map that everyone else had deemed worthless. What she couldn't possibly know was that the past was not done with the land, and its value was not measured in acres or dollars, but in secrets. The most valuable thing on that property wasn't the land itself, but a single undiscovered truth, waiting patiently in the dark, beneath a century of dust and neglect, for the rightful heir to finally come home. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, she dreamt of candles, thousands of them, their flames flickering in an immense darkness, whispering a name she had never heard before, Solomon. The weekends became their ritual of reclamation. Armed with work gloves from the hardware store, a couple of sturdy trash cans, and an optimism that felt both foolish and necessary, Alara and Leo would spend their Saturdays at the factory plot. It was a Sisyphean task. For every square foot they cleared of loose bricks and shattered glass, a mountain of debris still loomed. Yet the work was cleansing. The physical exertion was a release valve for the pressure that built up during the week. The condescending bosses, the constant calculations of pennies and dimes, the low-grade hum of anxiety that was the soundtrack to her life. Leo was in his element. He organized the rubble into distinct categories: cool, rusty metal, weirdly shaped bricks, and things that might be treasure for him. It was the world's greatest playground. For Alara, it was a way to connect with him, to build something together, even if that something was just a small, cleared patch of earth. She focused her efforts on an area near the one standing wall, where a concrete slab suggested a more permanent structure had once existed, perhaps an office or a foreman's station. It was here, on their third Saturday, that the world tilted on its axis. Leo had been trying to pry a long, bent piece of rebar from the ground when he called out, "Mama, the floor is hollow." Alara, hauling a bucket of smaller stones, paused and wiped the sweat from her brow. "What do you mean, sweetie?" He stomped his foot on the concrete slab. A dull, resonant boom echoed back, entirely different from the solid thud of the surrounding ground. "See? It's like a drum." Curiosity piqued. Alara knelt beside him. She ran her gloved hand over the surface, feeling for a seam, a crack, anything that would suggest a hidden cavity. The concrete was grimy, covered in a fine layer of brick dust and soil, but as she brushed it away, she saw it. A faint, perfectly straight line that formed a large rectangle, nearly invisible against the rest of the slab. It was a trapdoor, or what was left of one. Its metal handle had long ago rusted away, leaving only a faint orange-brown stain. Together, using the end of the rebar as a lever, they worked at the edge. It was heavy, sealed shut by decades of neglect. Alara's muscles screamed in protest, the metal groaning as she put her entire weight into the effort. With a final, wrenching crack, the seal broke. The concrete slab lifted a few inches, releasing a gust of stale, subterranean air. It smelled of cold earth, of dampness, and of time itself. Peering into the darkness below, they saw a set of steep, concrete steps descending into blackness. "A secret passage," Leo whispered, his eyes shining with adventure. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. It was likely just a storm cellar or a maintenance crawlspace, but the sudden discovery felt momentous. A secret the ruin had chosen to share only with them. Using the flashlight from her phone, which cut a weak, trembling beam into the void, she led the way down. The steps were slick with a fine layer of slime. At the bottom, they found themselves in a small, square room, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. It was remarkably preserved. While the factory above had been ravaged by fire, weather, and time, this subterranean chamber was largely untouched. The air was cold and still. The room was mostly empty, save for a thick layer of dust covering everything and a single, heavy-looking wooden desk pushed against the far wall. On the desk sat what looked like a metal strongbox, the kind used for important documents. It was coated in rust, but it was intact. Alara's light found it, and for a moment, she could only stare. This was not a storm cellar. This was an office, a hidden sanctuary. Someone had built this room to protect something. She approached the desk, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. The wood was warped and swollen with damp, but it held. The strongbox was locked. It was heavy, made of thick-gauge steel. It felt ancient and important. "Is it pirate treasure?" Leo asked, his voice hushed with reverence. "I don't know, baby," Alara breathed, her mind racing. Who had built this? Why was it hidden? What was so valuable that it needed to be stored in a concrete bunker beneath a factory floor? They had no way of opening it there. With considerable effort, she managed to lift the box. It was heavier than she expected. A dead, dense weight that spoke of consequence. Carrying it up the slippery steps was a struggle, and when they emerged back into the daylight, blinking against the sudden brightness, the world outside seemed changed. The ruined factory was no longer just a plot of land. It was a mystery, a place with a memory. Back in their small apartment, the box sat on their kitchen table, a dark, silent presence from another time. It dominated the room, an artifact from a life Alara couldn't imagine. While Leo chattered excitedly about what might be inside, gold coins, ancient maps, the secret formula for a soda that never went flat, Alara felt a growing sense of trepidation. Opening this box felt like crossing a threshold. It felt irreversible. After Leo was asleep, she took a hammer and a screwdriver to the lock. The metal was old, the rust deep. She worked for nearly an hour, the sharp clank of metal on metal the only sound in the quiet apartment. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock mechanism gave way. The lid creaked open. There was no gold, no jewels, no treasure a child would recognize. The box was filled with papers, a thick, leather-bound ledger, and nestled in a velvet-lined depression, a single, ornate, and impossibly heavy key made of a dark, non-tarnishing metal. Alara lifted the key first. It wasn't a normal key. It was large, intricately carved with a strange, geometric pattern on its head. It felt significant, a key to something far more important than a simple door. Then she turned to the ledger. The leather was stiff and cold. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, a looping cursive from a bygone era. The first entry was dated 1888, and at the bottom of the page a signature, Solomon Vance. Vance, her own last name. It was a coincidence, surely, a common name, but a cold shiver traced its way down her spine. She had never known her father's side of the family. He had left when she was a baby, a ghost in her life story. All she knew was his name. Her name, Vance. She flipped through the pages. They were filled with numbers, columns of assets and debits, mentions of properties in cities she'd never heard of, shipping manifests, stock certificates for companies that no longer existed. It was the meticulous record of a vast and complex business empire. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a sealed envelope, the wax brittle with age. Her name wasn't on it, but a title was, "To the one who values the ground." Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but still legible. The letter was from Solomon Vance. It spoke not of wealth, but of responsibility. He wrote of building his company from nothing, of the candles they made not just to sell, but to bring light into dark places. He wrote of a legacy he was entrusting not to the predictable winds of inheritance, but to fate. He had set up a trust, he explained, a repository for his life's work. It was to be left dormant, to grow, until a descendant of his bloodline proved themselves worthy. The test was simple. They had to find their way back to the source, to the factory land, and value it for what it was, the foundation, not for any treasure they hoped to dig up. "If you are reading this," the letter concluded, "you did not come here seeking riches, but a home. You have honored the soil from which this family grew. The key is now yours. It does not unlock a chest of gold, but a duty. Use this legacy not as a cushion upon which to rest, but as a lever with which to lift the world. Do not let the darkness win." Alara read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. A legacy, a duty, a great-great-grandfather she never knew existed had left her. What? A key to a forgotten trust? A cryptic message about lifting the world? It was insane. It was impossible. And yet, the heavy key sat on her table, a solid, undeniable fact. The ledger detailed a fortune that, Even accounting for the passage of time had to be immense. Solomon Vance, her ancestor, the factory hadn't just been a random plot of land. It had been her family's beginning. She had come home without even knowing it. The weight of it all settled upon her, heavier than any strongbox. This wasn't a lottery ticket. It was a mantle, and she was terrified she was not strong enough to wear it. The days that followed were lived in a surreal haze. Alara went through the motions of her life, serving coffee, cleaning silent, empty offices, making Leo's lunch. But her mind was elsewhere, lost in the looping cursive of Solomon Vance's ledger. The world felt thin, a veneer over a much deeper and more complicated reality she had just discovered. The key and the ledger lived in the strongbox, hidden under her bed. At night, she would pull them out, the cold metal of the key a familiar weight in her palm. She felt like a character in a book, someone whose ordinary life had been hijacked by an extraordinary plot. She had to know more. The name Solomon Vance became her obsession. She spent her breaks at the diner in the local library, her fingers dusty from scrolling through microfiche archives of old city newspapers. The Vance Candle Factory had been a cornerstone of the city's industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Solomon Vance was a prominent figure, a self-made man, an innovator known for his fair treatment of workers and his civic contributions. He had donated the land for the city's first public park. He had funded scholarships. He was, by all accounts, the kind of man who would write a letter about lifting the world. The factory had burned down in the Great Industrial Fire of 1948, a catastrophic event that had reshaped the city. The Vance family, it seemed, had scattered or faded from public life after that. There was no mention of a massive, enduring trust. The trail went cold. Her online searches were equally fruitless until she typed in a specific phrase from the ledger, the Argent Group, alongside Solomon's name. It was a holding company mentioned repeatedly in his records. The search returned a single cryptic result, a link to the charter of a private Swiss bank, a notoriously discreet institution named Sterling Fiduciary. The name itself sounded like a fortress. Her simple searches, however, did not go unnoticed. In the vast, invisible web of data that watches the world, a keyword had been tripped. An algorithm, dormant for decades, had just sent a silent, automated alert to a penthouse office overlooking the city. A few days later, the first shadow fell across her new reality. She was walking home from the bus stop when a car pulled up beside her. A long, black sedan so polished it seemed to suck the light out of the air around it. The tinted window slid down with a faint whir. Inside sat a man in a suit that cost more than her car. He was older, with silver hair and a smile that was perfectly manicured but didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Vance?" he asked, his voice smooth as velvet. Alara's heart gave a nervous lurch. "Yes. My name is Arthur Galloway. I represent the Ethelred Development Group." The name meant nothing to her. "We've been keeping an eye on the old industrial zone. We were very interested to see that someone purchased the defunct candle factory plot." He made it sound like a charming eccentricity. "It's a bold move. Most people see a ruin. You clearly see potential." I admire that. Alara clutched her purse strap. It was $1. Galloway chuckled. A dry, pleasant sound. The best investments often start small. Which brings me to my point. Ethelred is planning a major revitalization project for that entire district. We're prepared to buy all the outstanding parcels. For your 4 acres, ruinous as they are, we would be prepared to offer you $50,000. The number hung in the air, stunning her into silence. $50,000. It was a lifeline. It was a new apartment, a reliable car, a savings account. It was an end to the constant, grinding worry. It was a ticket out of her life. Her first instinct was a tidal wave of relief. Take it. Say yes. Run. But then she thought of Solomon's letter. To the one who values the ground, this man didn't value the ground. He saw a parcel, a line item on a budget for his revitalization project. He wanted to pave over her history. And Solomon's test. She had passed it by valuing the land enough to buy it for $1. Would she fail it now by selling it for $50,000? I'm not interested in selling, she heard herself say, the words feeling alien in her own mouth. Galloway's smile tightened by a barely perceptible fraction. Ms. Vance, with all due respect, it's a field of rubble. $50,000 is an exceptionally generous offer. It would be life-changing. The way he said it felt like a threat. He was telling her what her life was worth. He was telling her she was poor, and that this was her one and only chance. I'm sure it is, she said, her voice steadier now. But the answer is no. Perhaps you'd like to reconsider. Ethelred can be a very good friend, or a rather tedious obstacle. We have a vision for the city's future. It would be a shame for a small, sentimental attachment to stand in the way of progress. The velvet was gone from his voice. Now it was just cold steel. The land isn't for sale, she repeated, and turned to walk away, her legs feeling shaky. The black car remained there for a long moment before the window slid up and it pulled silently away from the curb. She didn't look back. She walked home in a state of shock, not at the offer, but at her refusal. She had just turned down a fortune, a tangible, real fortune, for a phantom one described in a 100-year-old letter. Was she a fool? Was she honoring a legacy, or chasing a ghost? That night, she held the key in her hand, its weight a reassurance. She had been tested and she had not failed. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was only the beginning. Arthur Galloway and Ethelred Development were not the kind of people who took no for an answer. She had woken something up, and now it was watching her. The world of power and money she had stumbled into was not going to simply let her be. It would come for her. It would come for her land. And it would try to take her inheritance before she even knew how to claim it. The encounter with Arthur Galloway left Alara feeling exposed, as if a spotlight had been turned on her quiet, invisible life. The city, which had once felt anonymous, now seemed filled with watching eyes. Every unfamiliar car on her street, every person who glanced at her for a second too long, sparked a fresh wave of paranoia. She knew, with gut-wrenching certainty, that she was out of her depth. The ledger was a labyrinth of financial jargon from another century, and the key was a useless artifact without the knowledge of what lock it fit. She needed help. She needed a guide. Her mind turned to Mr. Alastair Dubois. He was a neighborhood institution, a retired history professor who lived in a small house overflowing with books and maps. He ran a small, underfunded community center, and was a fierce advocate for preserving the city's history against the relentless tide of gentrification and corporate development. He had protested the demolition of landmarks and fought zoning changes that displaced longtime residents. If anyone knew the story of the Vance Candle Factory and the world it had belonged to, it would be him. She found him in his office at the center, a cramped space that smelled of old paper and dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. He was a tall, stooped man with kind, weary eyes behind thick spectacles. Alara, feeling like a child confessing a secret, laid out the story. She showed him the strongbox, the ledger, the key, and the letter from Solomon Vance. Mr. Dubois listened with rapt attention, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by an intense, scholarly focus. He handled the ledger with the reverence of a curator handling a priceless manuscript. He traced the signature of Solomon Vance with a single, long finger. "My word," he breathed, looking up at her, his eyes wide. "I've read about this man for years. Solomon Vance. He was a visionary, a philanthropist. His factory was famous for its profit-sharing model, unheard of at the time. He believed that a company was a community, not just an engine for profit. When the factory burned, it was considered one of the city's greatest tragedies. The heart of this neighborhood was ripped out. He examined the key, turning it over and over in his hands. Remarkable craftsmanship. And this ledger. Ms. Vance, this is more than just a family heirloom. This is a historical document of immense importance over the next week." They spent hours poring over the ledger. Mr. Dubois, with his academic's eye, began to decipher its secrets. The Argent Group, he explained, wasn't just a holding company. It was a shield. Solomon was buying up properties, businesses, stocks. But he was doing it quietly. He was creating a firewall around his assets, protecting them from his less scrupulous competitors. He pointed to a recurring entry. Deposit to S.F. Geneva, Sterling Fiduciary, Alara said, the name feeling heavy on her tongue. The Swiss bank, precisely. Mr. Dubois nodded. He was moving his wealth offshore, beyond the reach of his rivals. He was creating a fortress of capital. This trust, it wasn't just left to grow. It was designed to endure, to survive panics and crashes, to wait for the right time. And the right person, armed with this new understanding, Alara knew her next step. She had to go to the bank. Not to Switzerland, but to the American branch of Sterling Fiduciary. A sleek, imposing tower of glass and steel in the heart of the downtown financial district. It was a world away from her own. Mr. Dubois offered to go with her, a steadying presence in the face of what was sure to be an intimidating ordeal. The lobby of the bank was a cathedral of wealth. The ceilings were impossibly high, the floors were polished marble that reflected the cold, recessed lighting. The air was silent, sterile, and scented with money. People spoke in hushed tones, their movements gliding and purposeful. Alara felt clumsy, out of place. Her worn coat and nervous energy, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and effortless confidence around her. They were directed to the office of a senior trust manager, a man named Silas Croft. His office was a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city. Croft was impeccably dressed, with a cold, appraising gaze that seemed to calculate her net worth in a single glance. He did not rise to greet them. "How can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting they were an unwelcome interruption. Alara, her voice trembling slightly, explained her situation. She presented a copy of Solomon Vance's letter and placed the heavy, ornate key on the polished surface of his vast mahogany desk. The key seemed to absorb the light in the room, a dark, accusing object. Croft looked at the key, then at the letter, his expression unreadable. He steepled his fingers. "Vance," he said, testing the name. "An old account. Very old. Our records from that era are archived, of course. It would be a significant undertaking to locate them, but they do exist," Mr. Dubois pressed, his voice firm. Croft gave a dismissive shrug. "Theoretically, but a letter from the 19th century and a curiosity item like this key are hardly sufficient to initiate such a search. We require verifiable documentation, identification, proof of lineage. She is Alara Vance. She is his great-great-granddaughter," Mr. Dubois insisted. "A genealogical study would be required. A court order, perhaps. The process is complex," Croft said, his voice smooth and condescending. He was building a wall of bureaucracy in front of them, each word another brick. "These old trusts, they often have clauses. If an heir is not identified within a certain number of generations, the assets are absorbed by the holding institution. It's quite possible the Vance Trust no longer exists in any meaningful form." He was lying. Alara could feel it. The way he looked at the key, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He knew. He knew exactly what the Vance Trust was, and he had no intention of letting her near it. He was the gatekeeper, and the gate was closed. They left the bank defeated, the cold, sterile air of the lobby feeling like a final judgment. The wall of power and procedure seemed insurmountable. "He's stonewalling us," Mr. Dubois said, his voice grim as they stood on the bustling sidewalk outside. "He knows more than he's letting on. Much more." Alara looked up at the gleaming tower, a monument to a world that was designed to keep people like her out. She had the key, she had the proof, but she was locked out all the same. A new, cold fear began to creep in. It wasn't just that the bank was unhelpful, felt actively hostile. Silas Croft wasn't just a bureaucrat following procedure. He was a guard, and his presence suggested that the inheritance was not just a dormant account waiting to be claimed. It was a prize being protected and perhaps being plundered. She had Ethelred development trying to take her land, and now a powerful bank denying her legacy. The forces arrayed against her were no longer faceless. They had names and offices with panoramic views, and they were all telling her the same thing: go away. This doesn't belong to you. The walls began to close in. The refusal at the bank was a clear message, but the response from Ethelred Development was far more insidious. A week after her meeting with Silas Croft, a notice appeared on the door of Alara's apartment building. It was an official-looking document from the city's Department of Buildings, printed on bright orange paper. It declared the building in violation of a dozen obscure safety codes and ordered its immediate condemnation. Tenants were given 48 hours to vacate. Panic erupted in the hallways. Families who had lived there for years were suddenly facing homelessness. Alara knew with a sickening certainty that this was not a coincidence. It was a message from Arthur Galloway. It was retaliation. She couldn't prove it, of course. The violations listed were real enough: faulty wiring, asbestos, structural weaknesses, the kind of slow decay common in low-income housing that landlords and city inspectors conveniently ignored until it became inconvenient for someone powerful. Someone who wanted to apply pressure. Someone who wanted to demonstrate that they could reach into her life and tear it apart. The eviction notice was a calculated move, designed to plunge her into chaos, to make her so desperate that the $50,000 offer for the factory plot would seem not just generous, but like a salvation. The 2 days that followed were a blur of frantic packing and terrified phone calls. Alara, along with her neighbors, was thrown into the city's overburdened and under-resourced emergency housing system. She and Leo ended up in a cramped room in a shelter on the other side of town, a place that hummed with the quiet desperation of lives derailed. The room was small and smelled of disinfectant. Leo tried to be brave, but at night, she could hear him crying softly in his sleep. Her world had been reduced to 2 suitcases and a single shared bed. The pressure was immense. The temptation to just call Galloway, to take the money and end the nightmare, was a constant, screaming voice in her head. She was failing her son. She was dragging him into a fight that wasn't his. What good was a hypothetical, century-old legacy when her child didn't have a home? The community that had been her support system was fractured. Some neighbors looked at her with resentment, whispering that her stubbornness over a worthless piece of land had brought this down on all of them. Others, like the elderly Mrs. Gable from down the hall, saw it for what it was. "Don't you let them win, child," she had said, her hand gripping Alara's arm as they loaded their meager belongings into a charity van. "Men like that, they feed on the fear of people like us. You stand your ground, but what ground did she have left to stand on? Her apartment was gone. Her life was in a box. The only thing she truly owned was that field of rubble." One evening, unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere of the shelter, she took a bus back across town. She needed to see it. She needed to remember why she was doing this. The factory plot was dark under a moonless sky. The skeletal remains of the walls looked like ancient monoliths. The silence was profound. She walked to the center of the property, to the small patch of land she and Leo had cleared, and sat down on the cold concrete slab that covered Solomon's hidden office. She was exhausted. She was scared. She felt utterly and completely alone. She pulled the letter from her pocket. She carried it with her everywhere now, its paper soft and worn from repeated folding. She couldn't read the words in the dark, but she didn't need to. She knew them by heart. Use this legacy not as a cushion upon which to rest, but as a lever with which to lift the world. Do not let the darkness win the darkness. It was no longer a metaphor. It was Silas Croft's cold smile. It was Arthur Galloway's veiled threats. It was the orange condemnation notice on her door. It was the fear she saw in her son's eyes. These men thought they could crush her, that they could bury her under the weight of her own poverty. They saw her as a nuisance, a small, insignificant obstacle. They had miscalculated. They didn't understand that for someone who has nothing, a principle is the only thing you can't afford to lose. Sitting there, in the heart of her broken inheritance, a new feeling began to displace the fear. It was a cold, hard anger, a resolve that settled deep in her bones. They had taken her home. They had threatened her son. They had tried to make her small. They would not win. This land wasn't just a place of secrets. It was a battlefield now. Her battlefield. She thought of Solomon Vance, building a business to bring light into the world. She was his descendant. The fight was in her blood. She stood up, the dust of her ancestors' dream on her clothes. The wind whispered through the twisted rebar, a mournful sound that no longer sounded like an ending, but like a gathering storm. She was no longer just a single mother trying to survive. She was the guardian of a legacy, the inheritor of a duty, and she would not be moved. The eviction was meant to break her, but instead, it had forged her. She walked away from the factory that night not with a solution, but with a purpose as hard and unyielding as the concrete beneath her feet. The fight was no longer about money. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming a history that had been stolen and silenced. And she would see it through no matter the cost. The darkness had shown its face, and now she would show it hers. The shelter was a crucible, stripping away everything but the essentials. In the shared kitchens and crowded hallways, Alara saw her own struggle reflected in the faces of a dozen other families, each with their own story of displacement by a city that was rapidly becoming too expensive for the people who kept it running. The shared hardship, however, forged an unexpected bond. The whispers of blame died down, replaced by a quiet, simmering anger directed at the faceless developers and neglectful landlords. Her fight was becoming their fight. This small community, forged in crisis, became her first line of defense. Meanwhile, Mr. Du Bois had not been idle. The bank's stonewalling and Ethelred's aggression had lit a fire in the old historian. He retreated into his world of books and legal archives, convinced there was a way to crack the fortress of sterling fiduciary. These old trusts, especially the transnational ones, are governed by a patchwork of archaic laws. He explained to Alara over the phone, his voice buzzing with intellectual excitement. They're designed to be impenetrable, but nothing made by man is perfect. There's always a key, a loophole, a forgotten clause. He spent weeks buried in the university law library, calling in favors from former students who were now clerks and paralegals. He was searching for a precedent, a case, anything that could be used as a wedge to pry open the Vance Trust. Alara, in the meantime, focused on what she could control. She found a new, lower-paying job at a 24-hour laundromat closer to the shelter. It was grueling work, but it gave her a small measure of stability. And every spare moment, she returned to the factory. She and Leo, and now sometimes other kids from the shelter, would continue their work clearing the rubble. The plot was transforming from a symbol of her struggle into a symbol of her resilience. The cleared patch grew larger. They planted a small garden with seeds donated by a local church group. It was an act of defiant hope. Then, late one Thursday night, Mr. Du Bois called. "I've found it," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "It's an obscure piece of international fiduciary law from 1902, the heir of intent provision. It was designed to protect legacies from being deliberately obscured by predatory institutions. It states that if an heir can produce a unique, non-reproducible artifact, like, for instance, an ornate custom-made key, that is specifically referenced in the trust's founding charter, the bank is legally compelled to grant immediate provisional access to the records. They can't hide behind bureaucracy. They have to open the books. It was the weapon they needed." Mr. Du Bois also made another call to a former student of his, a young, hungry public interest lawyer named Anya Sharma. She was known for taking on corporate giants. When she heard Alara's story, she agreed to represent her pro bono. The second visit to Sterling Fiduciary was vastly different from the first. This time, Alara was not an intimidated woman clutching a letter. She walked in flanked by Mr. Du Bois, her historical expert, and Anya Sharma, her legal shield. They did not ask to see Silas Croft. Anya marched them directly to the bank's chief legal counsel and presented a formal petition invoking the 1902 heir of intent provision. She laid out their evidence: the letter, the ledger, and the key, which she placed on the table with a resounding thud. The bank's lawyers were caught off guard. They scrambled, making hushed phone calls. The provision was so old, so obscure, they likely hadn't even known it existed. But it was there, undeniable in their own legal charters. Their wall of procedure had been breached. Silas Croft was summoned. When he entered the conference room, The mask of polite condescension was gone. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a cold fury. He looked at Alara as if she were a ghost who had clawed her way out of a grave he had personally dug. He knew he was beaten. The bank had no choice. They were legally compelled to open the archives. The process took 2 days. 2 days in which Alara felt as if she were holding her breath. She stayed with Mr. Dubois, unable to return to the noise and despair of the shelter. Finally, Anya called. "You should sit down," she said, her voice strained. "They've found it. The Vance Trust. It was never dissolved. It was never dormant. It's been actively managed for over a century." There was a long pause. Alara could hear the rustle of papers on the other end of the line. "Alara," Anya said, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "The current valuation, after more than 120 years of compound interest, strategic investments. The current liquid value of the trust is $407 million. The number didn't compute. It was an abstraction, a string of sounds with no connection to reality. 407 million. It was more money than the entire neighborhood she grew up in would see in a lifetime. She thought of the dollar she had paid for the land. She thought of the eviction notice. She thought of washing other people's clothes for minimum wage. Her mind simply could not bridge the gap between that life and this number. Mr. Dubois, seeing the look on her face, put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Breathe, my dear," he whispered. "Just breathe," but she couldn't. The air was gone from the room. The number was a weight, a physical pressure crushing down on her. It wasn't the joyous, life-affirming moment she might have imagined. It was terrifying. It was the sound of her entire world, her entire sense of self, shattering into a million pieces. The money was real. The legacy was real. But in that moment of victory, as the reality of her inheritance finally crashed down upon her, Alara Vance had never felt more lost. The fight to claim her birthright was over. The fight to survive it was just beginning. The news broke like a dam. A low-level clerk at the bank, sensing the story of a lifetime, leaked the details to a journalist. The headline was sensational. "Single mother inherits $407 million forgotten fortune within hours." Alara's life was no longer her own. A swarm of news vans descended on the shelter, their satellite dishes pointing at the sky like metallic flowers. Reporters ambushed her outside the laundromat, shouting questions, their cameras flashing in her face. Her photograph was everywhere. A grainy, deer-in-the-headlights image that made her look both terrified and guilty. She was no longer Alara Vance, a person. She was a story, a modern-day fairy tale, a symbol of impossible luck. And everyone wanted a piece of her. She and Leo had to be moved from the shelter to a secure, undisclosed hotel, courtesy of Anya Sharma's law firm. The anonymity she had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a suffocating, 24-hour surveillance by the public eye. Her past was dissected on daytime talk shows. Her poverty was romanticized, her struggle repackaged as the gritty first act of a rags-to-riches blockbuster. No one seemed interested in the truth of it. The quiet desperation, the bone-deep weariness, the fight that had been about dignity, not dollars. The money, which was still a logistical and legal nightmare away from being in her control, had already changed everything. It was a gravitational force, bending the world around her. And then came the relatives. People she had never heard of, distant cousins twice removed, supposed descendants from other branches of the Vance family tree, emerged from the woodwork. They came with lawyers and hastily constructed genealogies, claiming a piece of the pie. They accused her of hiding the discovery, of trying to cut them out. They painted her as greedy and calculating. The irony was nauseating. The very people who embodied the grasping avarice Solomon Vance had sought to avoid were now using his name to try and tear his legacy apart. The pressure was a physical thing, a constant buzzing in her ears. The hotel room felt like a luxurious prison. Leo, confused and frightened by the chaos, retreated into himself. He missed his friends from the shelter. He missed their old, cramped apartment. He missed the simple, predictable rhythm of their life before the good news, He looked at her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read, a flicker of resentment in his eyes. She was his mother, but she had become a stranger, a harried, stressed woman constantly on the phone with lawyers. One evening, as they ate a room-service dinner in silence, he finally spoke. "I don't like the money," he said, pushing a piece of chicken around his plate. "It's loud. That was the perfect word for it. The money was a roaring, deafening noise that drowned out everything else. It drowned out her own thoughts, her own feelings. "I know, baby," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I know the internal conflict was the worst part. A part of her, the part that had worried about rent and groceries for so long, was giddy with the possibilities. She could give Leo everything. The best schools, the best doctors, a life free from the anxieties that had defined her own. She could buy a beautiful house, travel the world, never work another day in her life. This was the dream, wasn't it? The lottery ticket everyone hopes for. But another part of her was terrified. She looked in the mirror and saw the exhaustion in her own eyes, but also a new hardness. The fight with the bank and the developers had changed her, but this new battle, the battle against the sheer, crushing weight of the wealth itself, was different. It wasn't a fight against external enemies. It was a fight for her own soul. Solomon's letter felt like a distant memory from another life. A lever with which to lift the world. How could she lift anything when she felt like she was drowning? The temptation to simply take the money and disappear was overwhelming. She could create a new identity, move to a quiet town where no one knew her name, and build a safe, comfortable fortress for herself and her son. She could let the lawyers deal with the clamoring relatives and the media. She could just rest. It was a seductive thought, the cushion Solomon had warned her against. She found herself fantasizing about it, about the peace and quiet. But then she would look at the ornate key, which she now wore on a simple chain around her neck, hidden under her shirt. Its weight against her skin was a constant reminder. It wasn't a key to a vault of money. It was the key to a duty. The inheritance wasn't just the $407 million. It was the factory land. It was the name Vance. It was the responsibility her ancestor had passed down through time. To run away would be the ultimate betrayal. It would be an admission that the men like Croft and Galloway were right, that people like her couldn't handle power or responsibility, that all they understood was the desperate grasp for money. She was caught in a painful limbo. Her old life was gone forever, shattered by the revelation. But her new life, the life of a woman with immense wealth and power, was a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. She was a ghost, haunting the space between two worlds, and she didn't know which way to go. The cost of her inheritance was becoming terrifyingly clear. It was everything she used to be. The chaos of her newfound fame was the perfect cover for her old adversaries. While the world was distracted by the human interest story of the century, Ethelred Development and Silas Croft were not sitting idle. They were regrouping, preparing their final, decisive move. Anya Sharma, her lawyer, warned her. "These people don't just give up," she said during one of their late-night strategy sessions in the hotel. "They didn't get to where they are by playing fair or accepting defeat. They're cornered now. The public exposure is bad for them, but it also makes them more dangerous. They'll want to contain this, to cut their losses and silence you." The attack came not through legal channels or physical threats, but through a far more insidious weapon. Temptation, wrapped in the guise of a reasonable solution. A meeting was requested, not with Arthur Galloway, the public face of Ethelred, but with a team of lawyers representing a consortium. The consortium, Anya discovered, included Ethelred Development, Sterling Fiduciary, and several powerful, unnamed city investors. They were a united front. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a sterile conference room in a high-end law firm. Alara walked in with Anya and Mr. Dubois, her small council of 3 against their army of 6. Silas Croft was there, his face a mask of professional calm, but his eyes burned with resentment. He refused to look at Alara directly. The lead lawyer for the consortium, a woman with a deceptively warm smile, laid out their offer. It was, on the surface, incredibly generous. They called it a global settlement. "Ms. Vance, The lawyer began. This situation has become complicated. There are numerous claims against the estate. The litigation could drag on for years, a decade even. The legal fees alone would be astronomical, eating away at the principle of the trust. It will be a public, messy, and painful process for you and your son. She let that hang in the air before continuing. We are here to offer you a clean slate. An end to all of it. The offer was this. They would use their considerable legal power to validate Alara's claim as the sole primary heir, fast-tracking the process and sweeping aside all the other claimants. They would handle the media, creating a narrative that would allow her to retreat from the public eye. In exchange, she would sign over control of the Vance Trust to a new board, on which they would hold the majority of seats. She would also sell the factory land to Ethelred for a nominal fee. And for her trouble, they would deposit $50 million, tax-free, into a private account of her choosing. $50 million. Clean. Untouchable. No strings attached. An escape. It's a practical solution, Ms. Vance, Silas Croft said, finally speaking, his voice devoid of emotion. It gives you more money than you could ever spend, and it allows the assets of the trust to be managed by experienced professionals, to be used for what they were intended for. Generating further wealth and driving economic progress. He meant Ethelred's gentrification project. They wanted the money, and they wanted the land. This was their endgame. They were trying to buy her silence and her legacy for a fraction of its worth. It was the ultimate test. 50 million was no longer just a lifeline. It was a kingdom. It was generational wealth. It was safety, security, and peace. All she had to do was sign a piece of paper. All she had to do was let them win. She could walk away from the responsibility, from the fight, from the weight of Solomon's expectations. No one would blame her. They would call her smart, pragmatic. Mr. Dubois sat silently beside her, his expression grim. He knew what this was. Anya began to formulate a legal counter-argument, but Alara held up a hand to stop her. She needed to answer this herself. She looked across the polished table at the faces of the men and women who represented the consortium. They were the embodiment of the darkness Solomon had written about. The kind of people who saw a community as a parcel to be developed, a legacy as a resource to be plundered, and a person as an obstacle to be bought. They weren't just trying to take her money. They were trying to erase the meaning of it. They wanted to turn Solomon Vance's legacy of light into just another pile of anonymous, unaccountable capital. They wanted to prove that, in the end, everyone has a price. That principles are a luxury the poor cannot afford. Alara's mind was surprisingly calm. The noise of the past few weeks finally went silent. In that quiet, she felt the presence of her great-great-grandfather. She thought of him working late into the night, building his business, believing in a future he would never see, trusting a descendant he would never know. She thought of his simple test to value the ground. This was the real test, valuing what the legacy stood for, not just what it was worth. She slowly reached up and pulled the key from under her shirt. She held it in her fist, its sharp edges pressing into her palm. It was an anchor in the storm. "My ancestor," she began, her voice low but clear, filling the silent room, "did not create his fortune so that men like you could pave over his home to build luxury condos. He didn't write about lifting the world, so that a bank could use his money to hide the assets of other powerful men." She looked directly at Silas Croft, who flinched as if struck. He left this legacy in trust, waiting for someone who understood that its value was not in the number of zeros, but in its purpose. She stood up, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "The land is not for sale. The trust is not for sale. And neither am I." She turned to Anya and Mr. Dubois. "We're done here." As they walked out of the room, leaving the consortium in stunned silence, Alara felt a profound sense of release. She had been offered the world in exchange for her soul, and she had said no. It was the most terrifying and the most liberating decision of her life. She didn't know what would come next. The years of legal battles, the public scrutiny, the relentless pressure. But she knew who she was. She was not a lottery winner. She was not a victim. She was Alara Vance, the guardian of the Vance legacy. and the real work was about to begin. The refusal of the settlement was a declaration of war. The consortium, accustomed to getting its way through wealth and influence, was enraged by her defiance. They unleashed their legal armies, filing dozens of motions to contest her claim, support rival heirs, and mire the entire estate in a swamp of litigation designed to bleed it dry. The media, fed anonymous tips by the consortium's PR firms, began to paint her as a naive, stubborn woman being manipulated by a radical lawyer and a senile historian, jeopardizing a fortune that could be used for the public good. But Alara was no longer the woman who had been intimidated by a man in a black car. The fight had forged her into something new. She was calm, focused, and utterly resolute. With Anya Sharma's guidance, she began to fight back, not just for herself, but for the principle of the matter. Her first move was a masterstroke of public relations. Instead of hiding from the media, she embraced it. She gave one exclusive interview to a respected investigative journalist. She didn't talk about the money. She told her story, the story of buying a piece of forgotten land, of finding a connection to a family she never knew, of an ancestor's powerful vision. She read from Solomon's letter on camera, her voice steady and clear. She presented herself not as an heiress, but as a custodian. The narrative began to shift. She was no longer just a lucky woman who stumbled into a fortune. She was a protector of a historical legacy against corporate greed. Public support began to rally behind her. Donations flowed into a legal defense fund set up by Anya. The story of David and Goliath is timeless for a reason. Her next step was even bolder. While the legal battles raged in courtrooms, she turned her attention to the source of it all, the factory land. She announced the formation of the Vance Foundation, a non-profit entity to be funded by the trust once it was released. Its mission was simple: to fulfill Solomon Vance's mandate to bring light into dark places, the Foundation's first project. She declared at a press conference held on the rubble-strewn plot itself, would be the rebuilding of the Vance Candle Factory. Not as a factory for candles, but as a beacon for the community. It would be a state-of-the-art community center, offering job training programs, after-school care for children, a legal aid clinic for tenants' rights, and a historical archive dedicated to preserving the city's industrial heritage, curated by Mr. Du Bois. It was a direct rebuke to Ethelred's vision of luxury condos. It was a promise to the neighborhood that had been left behind, the same neighborhood that had rallied around her when she was evicted. She was using her newfound power to lift up the community that had supported her. The announcement sent shockwaves through the city. The consortium's narrative of her being selfish and naive collapsed. How could they argue that their private development project was a better use of the land than a center designed to serve the very people they had sought to displace? Their position was becoming untenable. The legal tide began to turn. The courts, influenced by the swell of public opinion and Anya Sharma's brilliant legal arguments, began dismissing the frivolous claims against the estate one by one. The consortium's strategy of endless litigation was backfiring, making them look like bullies. Finally, after a grueling 18-month battle, the last appeal was struck down. The courts formally recognized Alara Vance as the sole rightful heir and executor of the Vance Trust. The war was over. The day the funds were officially transferred, there was no grand celebration. Alara sat with Anya and Mr. Du Bois in the small, temporary office they had rented for the foundation. The number on the bank statement on her laptop screen was still incomprehensible, a string of digits that felt more like a cosmic equation than money. She felt not elation, but a profound sense of peace. The weight of the fight was gone, replaced by the weight of the responsibility. It felt right. Felt like what she was born to do. The final scene of her old life was not set in a courtroom or a bank, but back on the land. The demolition crews had finished their work, clearing away the last of the rubble, but leaving the original foundation intact, as Alara had insisted. It was a clear, cold autumn day. The groundbreaking ceremony for the new Vance Community Center was about to begin. The crowd was a mix of everyone her journey had touched. Her old neighbors from the evicted apartment building, members of the community who had supported her, city officials who had belatedly jumped on her bandwagon, and a throng of reporters. Alara stood on the podium, not in a designer suit, but in simple, practical clothes. Leo stood beside her, his hand in hers, no longer a frightened child in a shelter, but a quiet, proud boy who had watched his mother move mountains. She looked out at the crowd, at the hopeful faces, and then down at the ground beneath her feet, the soil that had started it all. She thought of the single dollar she had paid, the best investment ever made. She thought of Solomon Vance, a man she had come to know through his words and his deeds. She was his harvest, his long-awaited return. A legacy isn't something you receive, she said, her voice carrying over the crowd, strong and sure. It's something you build. My great-great-grandfather built a business, but he left a legacy of purpose. He gave us a foundation. Now it's our turn to build upon it. It's our turn to bring the light. She and Leo took up a single, silver shovel together. They plunged it into the earth, the rich, dark soil that had held a secret for over a century. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. The inheritance wasn't the $407 million. That was just the fuel. The true inheritance was the purpose, the duty, and the chance to build a better world on the forgotten ground of the past. And as she looked up at the sky, clear and blue, Elara Vance, the woman who had once owned nothing but $1's worth of ruin, knew she was finally home.